So there's a kind of boiled or blanched California poppy in the emotions of the Californians. It's like 10:30 and it's still dark because of the fires. I've been thinking about trying to approach these problems of the possible identity of Heidegger's saying that the most interesting, or sorry, the most thought-provoking thing about these thought-provoking times is that we are not yet thinking, and the Gelassenheit or releasement. So learning how to think as releasement. How can we approach that? I think one avenue is going back to the most ancient texts and observing the way the doctrine of the Suke emerged amidst the original thinking of physis or nature. We have about in the 7th century BC Hesiod's Works and Days, which is like 300 years before the death of Socrates. Hesiod's giving advice, I can't remember, I think to a younger brother, maybe to a son or a nephew, I'm not sure. But near the end of that work, he characterizes talk, persistent talk, rumor, in line 7, what is it, 764, 762, 764, something like that. It's near the end of the book. He speaks of persistent rumor, persistent talk as being a theoi or a theos, as a god, because persistent rumors are persistent talk, persistent utterances, however you want to translate it, are in some way an immortal power. But trying to see more naturally what theoi meant in the Greek context. Of course, remembering that Leo Strauss says we can't understand our tradition except by comparing the Greeks to the Hebrew tradition. And of course, God means something quite different in the Hebrew tradition than it does in the Greek tradition. But theoi here we have, therefore, that's one testament to what, let's say, a kind of archaic avant-garde thinker, Hesiod, thought that theoi was about, and it's linked to words. Now, if you jump forward to Sophocles' Antigone, in the Antigone, which is actually written during Socrates' lifetime when he was about, I think it came out or was first performed, probably this is a reliable date, so around the time when Socrates was about 30 years old. And this is a text which was vying with, it was part of a polemic. It was attacking the other Greek settlements, which I suppose by Aristotle's standard were not even deserved the name polis, because Aristotle thought a polis meant that there were one collective goal. So most of the plays of that period of Sophocles and some of the other writers that wrote about Thebes were used Thebes as the whipping boy of Athens, because Athens is the city of the citizens, where there are the rational regimes which are for the sake of the citizens, rather than the city of the powerful families, the mafia, the blood feuds, and all kinds of tyrannical in the worst sense. Occurrences such as Antigone being denied the right to bury her brother. So it doesn't always come out in the analysis of this, but if you look at the book on the ancient city, which is the same title in French in the original, written by, I forget the name, Numa something or another, which is still very recommended by Leo Strauss as a guide to ancient religion. What he says there are to, not ancient religion in general, but to, let's say, Mediterranean and Greek religion through excerpts from the still extant text. What he says is, he doesn't, I believe, mention Antigone in particular, but if you take what he says, the reason why people were so anxious to see their dead buried was because of the belief of that the suke was still in the corpse, and it had to be properly interred, otherwise havoc would be wreaked. So this is the kind of archaic leftover which goes back way beyond. You can see Hesiod was already enlightened in hundreds of years before this, right? He already wouldn't have been so worried about that, but the general population was still worried about that. So probably Sophocles knew that, but he was speaking of an older way of thinking. But now, if one says this way of thinking, which Antigone sort of gropes with herself, and she doesn't quite know why, but she knows that it's wrong, that Creon is decreed that his body shall be left exposed due to his to his crimes against the state, which is really Creon's whim, as Sophocles is making it appear, because this is one of the nasty mafia states rather than the enlightened Athens. I think that shows somehow something, that if we superimpose what's happening in what Plato is showing us deliberately in his dialogue, the Euthyphro, about the theoi, about the gods, we can see a lot there. So in Antigone, it's still, Antigone doesn't even really lay out what's happening, but she just knows that it's wrong, what's happening. It's the gods are still within. In the Euthyphro, Plato deliberately abstracts from the Euthyphro the doctrine, any talk of the suke. And the reason for that is because the theoi, or the gods, are replaced in the rational tradition by the doctrine of the suke, or the soul, and then they're separated. So in the Euthyphro, what happens is that Euthyphro claims to know what the theoi want. He claims to have better insight to this. But we can see what that means even if you go to, say, an example from Dostoevsky, from his short story, The Ridiculous Man, where he observes out in the street, there's a girl wandering around who he thinks her mother might be sick somewhere, and she's disheveled, and there's the figure of a man stalking her as though to abduct her, and the suggestion is pedophilia. So, but the nihilism in Dostoevsky is then brought out by that the character is so indifferent to everything that he's not going to intervene, and he even doubts whether his inner impulse, which would be a theoi, which would be like the theoi in the way it's described in the the Euthyphro, he ignores that. So I think we can still see what that means. You have an impulse to, you think something is simply wrong. Like not long ago, I observed a younger, stouter man abusing an older man whose bodily strength was insufficient to fight back. And you think you have to, there's certain situations where one has this natural feeling of intervening, and then you turn that into the talk of what the gods want and so on. And so, as I've mentioned in the past, Cicero, in his answer to Plato's Republic, mentions that what the Greeks meant by the theoi was the ego arbiter. But I feel like when we look back at this idea of Antigone, you see it sort of blends even further into just everything's there together, forcefully demanding something. And we can even see that in ourselves to some extent, the lack of the separation out of these things. So I wanted to just lay that down as just something we can work with and try to give a more subtly nuanced exactitude, so far as it admits of exactitude, to this whole theme in trying to think what it means that we're not yet thinking. It's as though this happened, just drifted apart. These ideas drifted apart to theoi and the physis, or the body, and then eventually you get the doctrine of the suke and the various compartments of the suke, where the highest compartment is nous, and eventually you get this idea of the demiurge, who then one can say, oh, you are not really God, you're just a symbol. You take yourself for God, the demiurge in the Neoplatonic text. And then the whole critique of Eastern Christianity against Catholicism, which is in a way worshiping the Platonic agathon, or the good as the demiurge, and all of these issues, which become what Heidegger then, at the so-called end of metaphysics, describes as ontotheology. So we're not getting to being, because when Heidegger, I'll leave with the one thought that I want to go further into. I think it's one avenue to thinking being is that nothing is not the opposite of being. I think that's one way of sort of touching as a meditation on what is meant by being. Nothing is not the opposite of being, and time is one, but again, one is the specific concept. So with hen rather than ta panta is a specific concept, and this first step, which was so important for the early thinkers, that you could use number as something which is eternal and gives you a first a foothold into knowledge proper, is still there. So nothing is not the opposite of being, because nothing is something that is. It's a being that is. It's one being among others. If I were to just say being also is not a being. I think there's an avenue to thinking that through, connected to the causal issues. Like, for instance, there's a big mistake in the usual reasoning about multiple worlds, because the multiple worlds type of theory in connection to probabilities in physics assume that there's a different time in each of the worlds, or in each of these possible, so-called possible worlds, the possible world theories. But time is one. You can't. Time is one. Being is one. They're just positing multiple times, but time is one. It's just like space is one. When you think in terms of Einstein, it doesn't. It only makes instrumental sense to say that space is curved, right? Because what you're doing is space is straight in the normal way, but the curve is juxtaposed against the way we think it. Like there's a star at a great distance, and then it has to take this Malinowski, this teacher of Einstein that came up with the Malinowski lines, or whatever they're called, Mininowski lines, I forget his name. These lines that are like the things you have in Buckminster Fuller, the lines that are actually the quickest, even though they're not straight. But you see how they're juxtaposed against what seems naturally to be straight. There's a star, I see it, it seems to be straight, but the line of quickest motion is not the straight line. Like these, but in any case, I think we can design a meditation that brings us closer to being along those lines. I'll try to do that. I'll try to think it through better, but I think it's good for just to get the basic groundwork of the area that we're trying to traverse and walk around in, the path we're trying to get to fill it out with some details in this recording before we do that.